The sun was just beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the quiet suburban streets. The air was warm, and Ruby Johnson, a black pregnant woman in her late 20s, drove slowly, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She had just finished her doctor's appointment and was eager to get home to her husband, Jacob. She could feel their baby moving gently in her belly, and despite the usual discomfort of her third trimester, she felt a sense of peace. But that peace didn't last long. In her rearview mirror, Ruby noticed flashing lights, a police car right behind her. A knot formed in her stomach. She hadn't been speeding, and she knew her taillights were working fine. Why was she being pulled over? She took a deep breath and slowly pulled to the side of the road, trying to calm her nerves. As a black woman, Ruby had heard too many stories about what could go wrong during encounters with the police. Her husband, Jacob Lewis, had made a career out of defending people who had faced police brutality. Ruby thought back to the stories he shared with her at the dinner table. People who were hurt, families who had been torn apart because of a single moment of injustice. Now she was in that same terrifying situation. Her heart raced as she watched the police officer, a white man with a hard, cold expression, approach her car. He moved with an air of arrogance, his hand resting on his holster. Officer Declan. His name was stitched on his uniform, but it was his attitude that struck Ruby most. The way he looked at her, the way his eyes narrowed as if he had already judged her. He saw her as a threat, not as a person. Ruby rolled down her window just enough to hear him clearly. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with a polite greeting. His tone was rough, his face void of any kindness. Ruby's hands shook as she reached for her purse to get her ID. She felt a baby kick hard, a reminder of her vulnerability in that moment. She handed over her license and registration without saying a word, hoping that if she kept quiet, nothing bad would happen. Declan took her documents without even looking at them and stared at her through the window. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. Ruby blinked in confusion. "I was just coming back from my doctor's appointment. I'm on my way home," she explained, her voice soft but steady. She tried to keep it calm, but her heart was pounding. Declan didn't seem to care. He looked her over with narrowed eyes, as if waiting for her to slip up, to give him some reason to escalate the situation. There was a thick silence as he steadied her, and Ruby felt her throat tighten. Something wasn't right. "What's in the car?" Declan asked suddenly, his tone sharp. "Any drugs? Weapons?" He leaned down slightly, his face coming closer to the window. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. "No, officer. I don't have anything like that," she replied, her hands now gripping the steering wheel tightly. This wasn't normal. He was treating her like a criminal for no reason. Ruby tried to keep her voice calm, but fear was creeping into her words. She wasn't sure how to handle this. Should she stay quiet or stand up for herself? Declan wasn't satisfied. "Step out of the car," he said, taking a step back. Ruby's stomach dropped. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was he asking her to get out? "Officer, is there a reason?" she asked carefully, trying not to sound confrontational. But inside, she was terrified. She glanced around, hoping someone might see what was happening, hoping for a witness. There were no cars on this street, no one walking by. Declan's patience seemed to snap. He slammed his hand on the roof of the car, his voice rising with aggression. "I said get out of the car! Now!" His face twisted in anger, and Ruby felt the full weight of the situation crash down on her. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was something darker. Slowly, her hands trembling, Ruby unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed open the door. She moved slowly, her large belly making it difficult to move quickly, but Declan wasn't giving her any time. As soon as her feet hit the ground, before she could fully stand, she felt the sharp, brutal force of his boot against her side. Ruby screamed in pain as she fell to the ground, clutching her stomach. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a terrifying moment, all she could think about was her baby. The kick had landed dangerously close to her abdomen and she could barely breathe. What had just happened? Why had he done that? She looked up at Declan in shock, her vision blurry from the tears welling in her eyes. Declan stood over her, towering, his expression cold and indifferent. "Stay down," he growled, as if she were the one in the wrong, as if she had somehow deserved this. Ruby gasped for air, her hand instinctively cradling her belly, trying to feel for movement, for any sign that her baby was okay. Her mind raced in a million directions. How could this be happening? How could he just attack her like that, a pregnant woman, for no reason? She had heard about these things happening to others, but never in her worst nightmares had she thought it would happen to her. Lying on the ground, Ruby's thoughts turned to Jacob. Jacob. Her husband had fought tirelessly against men like Declan. He had taken on countless cases, standing up for people who had been mistreated by the very system meant to protect them. And now, here she was, a victim of that same abuse. Could she even make it home to tell him what had happened? The world around her felt distant, like she was floating in a haze of shock and pain. The sound of her own heartbeat was loud in her ears as she tried to pull herself together, trying to think clearly. What could she do? What should she do? She needed help. She needed someone to see this, someone to stop this man before things got worse. But there was no one here, no witnesses, just her and this racist cop who had already shown he had no problem hurting her. Ruby's phone was still in the car. If she could just reach it, she could call Jacob. He would know what to do. He always knew what to do. But could she move without making things worse? Declan stood over her, breathing heavily, his hand still resting on his gun, as if he were waiting for her to make a wrong move. The power dynamic was clear. He thought he was in control, thought he could do whatever he wanted to her, and no one would care. But he didn't know. He didn't know who her husband was. He didn't know the kind of man Jacob was, or the lengths he would go to protect his family. Declan had no idea that the woman he had just kicked had a husband who would stop at nothing to bring him to justice. And that was the mistake that would cost him everything. The world felt frozen for a moment, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on Ruby like a crushing force. But deep inside, she felt something stronger than the fear, something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the terror and the pain. Determination. She wasn't going to let this end here. Not like this. Not today. Ruby could still feel the harsh impact of Officer Declan's boot as she sat in her living room that night, replaying the entire traumatic event in her mind. It felt surreal how a simple drive to the grocery store had turned into something out of a nightmare. The cold ground beneath her, the pain in her side, and the officer's sneer were etched deeply into her memory. Yet what hurt her more than the physical pain was the sense of helplessness. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been treated like a criminal. Why? Because of the color of her skin. The evening was quiet, the only sound being the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ruby glanced at it absent-mindedly, realizing she had been home for hours, yet she hadn't told Jacob what happened. She didn't know how. He had been in court all day, fighting to expose injustice. And here she was, sitting in the middle of her own personal horror. How would he react? How could she explain that she had been attacked, not just by anyone, but by a white police officer, the very kind of injustice he was constantly fighting against? She winced as she shifted on the couch, the soreness in her stomach reminding her of the brutality she had endured. As her hand rested on her growing belly, a deep wave of emotion swept over her. What if the baby had been hurt? She had been too scared to even think about it during the attack, but now that fear was all she could focus on. She could still hear the officer's voice in her head, demanding that she step out of the car, his tone full of impatience and authority. "Step out of the car," he had yelled, without explaining why. She had tried to remain calm, to explain that she was pregnant and had done nothing wrong, but he didn't care. All he saw was a black woman who wasn't obeying him fast enough, and before she knew it, she was on the ground, and he was walking away as if nothing had happened. Ruby's phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Jacob. "Headed home. Long day. I love you." Her heart pounded in her chest as she read the message. How was she supposed to tell him what had happened? She looked at the front door, half expecting him to walk in any second, his strong presence filling the room. Jacob was always the one who made her feel safe, He was the fighter in their relationship, the one who stood up to the powerful, and he did it with such calm, methodical strength. But today, the battle had come to their front door. Today, it had knocked her down, quite literally. Suddenly her phone buzzed again. It was a video link from her friend Lisa. The message under it read, "Is this you?" Ruby's stomach dropped as she clicked the link. The video began playing immediately. It was shaky, clearly filmed on someone's phone, but she recognized the scene right away. The camera was pointed at her car, and she could see herself stepping out, her face a mix of confusion and fear. The next moment, she was being shoved to the ground by Officer Declan. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched herself fall, helplessly clutching her stomach as she hit the pavement. The video wasn't long, but it was long enough to show the world what had happened, long enough to capture the moment when a white officer, full of power and authority, used unnecessary violence against a pregnant black woman for no reason. She could hear the murmurs of the people filming, their shocked gasps as the officer's boot connected with her side. "This is crazy," one of them had whispered. She didn't do anything. Ruby's fingers hovered over the screen as the video came to an end. She felt numb. There it was, all laid out in pixels and sound. The assault, the racial bias, the complete disregard for her humanity. It had all been caught on camera, and now the world could see it too. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Lisa. "I'm so sorry this happened to you. People are sharing this everywhere. We're behind you, Ruby." Behind her? Ruby's mind raced as the reality of the situation set in. People were seeing this. Strangers were watching the moment she was attacked, and they were taking sides. Some, like Lisa, were undoubtedly supportive. But others, what would they say? Ruby knew how these things played out. She had seen it before with other black victims of police violence. There would be those who blamed her, who said she must have done something wrong, that she wasn't following the officer's commands quickly enough. They would try to justify what had happened to her. They always did. But there was no justification. Not this time, not with her. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't been rude. She hadn't done anything but drive down the road. And yet, this was how it ended. The front door opened quietly, and Ruby looked up to see Jacob standing in the doorway, his briefcase in one hand, his eyes searching her face. He could sense something was wrong immediately, the tension in the air, the heaviness in her posture. "Ruby?" he asked softly, stepping closer. "What happened?" Her throat tightened as she tried to find the words. She didn't want to break down. She didn't want to add to the stress he was already dealing with. But as soon as she saw the worry in his eyes, the dam broke. He kicked me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob's expression hardened. "Who kicked you?" "A police officer," she replied, tears beginning to blur her vision. "Today, I was just driving and he pulled me over, and then he kicked me." Jacob dropped his briefcase to the floor as he moved quickly to her side. His hands gently cradled her face, his eyes wide with concern. "Ruby, are you hurt? Is the baby okay?" "I think so," she said, her voice cracking. "But I'm scared, Jacob. It happened so fast and I couldn't stop it." Jacob's jaw clenched, and she could see the anger building behind his usually calm exterior. He was furious, and rightfully so. Ruby had seen him get angry before, but this was different. This was personal. "Who was the officer?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know his name," she admitted, "but there's video. People filmed it. I just saw it." She handed him the phone, the video already queued up. Jacob watched in silence as the video played, his face becoming more rigid with each passing second. When it ended, he let out a slow, controlled breath, though she could tell it was taking every ounce of restraint for him not to explode. "This is why we fight," he finally said, his voice shaking with rage. "This, right here. This is why I go to court every day. But this, Ruby, this happened to you, to our family." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him." Jacob wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the protective anger that had ignited within him. This wasn't just about the work he did. This was about protecting his wife, his child, from a world that didn't seem to care about their lives. "We're going to fight this," he said, his voice a mixture of pain and determination. "We're going to hold him accountable." Ruby pulled away slightly, her eyes searching his. What if it's not enough? What if he gets away with it, like they always do? Jacob shook his head. "Not this time. Not with you. Not with our family." Ruby's phone buzzed again, this time with more messages from friends and strangers alike. She hadn't even realized how fast the video was spreading. Within hours, it seemed like the entire world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. As Jacob looked down at the messages, his mind was already turning. The pieces were falling into place. This was the fight of his life, and now it was personal. He wasn't just fighting for justice in the abstract anymore. He was fighting for Ruby, for their unborn child, and for the countless others who had faced the same kind of violence and discrimination. He wasn't going to let Officer Declan get away with this. And Ruby knew, deep down, that Jacob would do everything in his power to make sure justice was served. The neighborhood was buzzing with disbelief and fury. The video of Ruby being kicked by Officer Declan was all over social media, shared thousands of times in just a few hours. It was hard to watch, harder still to believe that something so brutal could happen in their own community. In the clip, Ruby could be seen struggling to get up, clutching her stomach while the officers stood over her, not offering any help. People were shocked, but not surprised. Many in the black community had seen officers treat them this way before, but now there was proof, and this time it felt different. The video began with the sound of a car door opening and Officer Declan's harsh voice barking orders at Ruby. "Get out of the car!" he yelled. The shaky footage, taken from a nearby witness's phone, zoomed in on Ruby's frightened face. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't even arguing. She was just trying to explain that she was pregnant and needed to move slowly. Her hands trembled as she opened the car door. That's when the kick came. The camera shook as gasps could be heard from the onlookers. It only took a few seconds for the video to show what happened, but those few seconds left a deep impact. Comments flooded in under every post of the video. "This is disgusting. How can this still be happening? Justice for Ruby." Some people cried out for the officer to be fired. Others demanded that he be arrested. As the video spread, it wasn't just the community who saw it. Local news stations picked it up, and soon the footage was on TV screens across the state. It was impossible to ignore, but while most people were horrified by what they saw, there were still some who tried to defend Officer Declan. They claimed Ruby must have done something wrong for the officer to react that way. Others said she should have followed his orders faster, as if being kicked was her fault. But for the black community, this wasn't about following orders. This was about yet another instance of a white officer abusing their power against a black person. They didn't need any more proof of the racism that ran deep in the police force. They had lived it. Now, with Ruby's assault caught on camera, they hoped this could be the turning point. Maybe this time, things would be different. Outside the police station, a small group of people began gathering. At first, it was just a handful of Ruby's neighbors, people who had known her for years, who knew her kind heart and gentle spirit. They held signs with her name on them and demanded that Officer Declan be held accountable. Just as for Ruby, they shouted as cars passed by, honking in support. As the hours passed, more and more people joined the protest. It wasn't long before the crowd swelled, spilling out into the street. Families came, children in tow, holding signs and chanting for justice. Community leaders showed up, speaking out against the officers' actions and the deep-rooted racism in the police department. They had been here before, fighting for justice in a system that seemed determined to deny it to them. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Officer Declan sat at his desk, scrolling through his phone. He had seen the video too, but he didn't seem worried. He had been on the force for over 10 years and had seen complaints like this come and go. The police union had always backed him up, and his fellow officers usually shrugged off accusations of brutality as part of the job. He didn't see himself as a racist, just as someone who was doing what needed to be done. But this time was different, and even Declan could feel the shift. The volume of attention this case was getting was unlike anything he'd experienced before. The protests outside were growing louder, and people were demanding answers. For the first time in his career, Declan began to wonder if maybe he had gone too far. Still, he didn't feel sorry. He had acted on instinct, his instinct. And in his mind, that instinct was never wrong. Ruby had been slow to respond, slow to follow orders. To Declan, that was enough. But what he hadn't realized was that Ruby wasn't just any random person. She wasn't someone the system could easily sweep under the rug. And soon, he was going to find out exactly why. As the sun set and darkness fell, the protest outside the station didn't die down. If anything, it grew louder. People held candles, their faces lit by the soft glow, and they chanted Ruby's name into the night. News crews arrived, setting up cameras and interviewing community members who spoke passionately about the injustice they had witnessed. The video of the assault played on a loop, hauntingly silent as it flashed across the screens of every major local news station. "You can't let this go," one woman told a reporter, her voice shaking with emotion. "This could have been my daughter, my sister. We're tired of being treated like this, and we won't stop until we get justice." At the center of the crowd, an older man stood quietly, watching the protest unfold with a heavy heart. His name was Mr. Jackson, a lifelong resident of the neighborhood. He had seen this kind of thing happen too many times in his 60 years. He had seen the way the police treated his community, with suspicion, with fear, and too often, with violence. But he had also seen how quickly the police closed ranks around their own, protecting each other while the victims were left to pick up the pieces. He sighed as he watched the scene. He knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but something in the air felt different this time. Maybe it was the sheer number of people who had come out to support Ruby. Maybe it was the fact that the video was so clear, so undeniable. Or maybe it was because, for once, it felt like the entire community was united in their demand for justice. Across town, in a quiet hospital room, Ruby lay in bed, recovering from the trauma of the assault. Her stomach ached, and the doctors had told her to rest, but her mind was racing. She had watched the video too. She had seen herself fall, seen the look on Officer Declan's face as he kicked her without a second thought. It wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the way she had been treated, the way he had looked at her like she didn't matter. But Ruby did matter, and her husband Jacob was determined to make sure the world knew it. Sitting by her bedside, he held her hand tightly, his mind already racing with legal strategies. He knew how these cases worked, how the system was designed to protect officers like Declan. But he wasn't going to let that happen this time, not to his wife. Outside, the protests continued to grow, and as more people joined the cause, the pressure on the police department mounted. Calls flooded in from local politicians, community leaders, and even celebrities who had seen the video and were outraged by what had happened. The demand for justice was deafening, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't going to go away quietly. Officer Declan, still sitting at his desk, began to feel the walls closing in around him. The chants from the protesters outside grew louder with every passing hour. His fellow officers had stopped joking about the situation. They too had seen the video, and they knew that things were about to get serious. Some of them had even started distancing themselves from Declan, knowing that he was going to be the center of a storm unlike any they had faced before. By the time morning came, the crowd outside the police station had swelled to hundreds, their signs and voices a visible reminder that this time, the community wasn't going to back down. The pressure on the police department to take action was immense, and rumors began to spread that something had to give. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Would Officer Declan finally face the consequences of his actions? As the sun rose, casting a golden light over the city, the world watched and waited. Jacob was in the middle of a busy day in court, flipping through papers and making notes for his next case. It was one of those days that stretched on forever, and he hadn't even had time to check his phone. His work as a civil rights attorney often felt like swimming against a strong current, fighting injustice in a system that seemed unwilling to change. But it was his passion, and he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The case he was working on that day involved a young man who had been wrongfully arrested, and as always, Jacob was fully immersed in preparing the arguments. He was in the zone, focused and ready, when his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, There were always distractions, and court was about to start again. But then it buzzed again, and again. Jacob frowned, pulling his phone from his pocket, planning to silence it. He glanced at the screen, and his heart skipped a beat. There were dozens of notifications, mostly missed calls and messages from his wife's number. Something wasn't right. The first message that caught his eye was from a friend. "Jacob, you need to see this now," it said. His heart pounded as he tapped the link. It was a video. He couldn't see it properly at first because of the bright courtroom lights, so he stepped outside into the hallway, finding a quieter spot. When he finally saw the screen clearly, his blood ran cold. The video showed a police officer standing over a black woman. That was Ruby, his Ruby. She was on the ground, clutching her stomach, gasping for air. Jacob's throat went dry, his breath catching as he watched Officer Declan, a white cop, kick her while she was down. The sound of his wife crying out in pain sent a chill through his whole body. Jacob's mind went blank for a second, his body frozen in place, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The timestamp on the video showed that it had been recorded just a couple of hours ago. The video ended, but Jacob didn't move. The scene replayed over and over in his head. He knew the dangers that came with being black in America. He had fought against it for years. He had seen so many cases of police violence and racial profiling, but now it wasn't just another client. This time, it was his wife. His hand shook as he fumbled to dial Ruby's number. She didn't pick up. The phone rang and rang until it went to voicemail. Panic surged through him as he tried again, his mind racing. What had happened to her? Was she okay? Where was she now? How had this happened to his family? Jacob was still in shock when his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Ruby's friend, Keisha. "Jacob, are you okay?" she asked, her voice breathless with worry. "Where is she?" Jacob demanded, his voice tight with fear. "Where's Ruby? Is she okay?" Keisha hesitated. "She's at the hospital," she said softly. "She's shaken up. But the baby seems fine. They're running some tests." Jacob closed his eyes, his body sagging against the wall. Relief washed over him, but the anger that followed was swift and sharp. He was relieved that Ruby and the baby were alive, but the image of that white cop kicking his pregnant wife stayed burned in his mind. He gripped his phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I'll be there soon," Jacob said, his voice low but determined. He ended the call and immediately texted his assistant to reschedule the rest of his day. He didn't care about the case he had been preparing for anymore. All he could think about was Ruby. As he rushed out of the courthouse, the rest of the world felt distant. His car keys were in his hand before he even reached the parking lot. The drive to the hospital was a blur, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Every stoplight felt like an eternity, every delay like an extra burden on his chest. He could still hear Ruby's pained cry from the video playing in his head on repeat. When he finally arrived at the hospital, he practically ran through the doors, barely stopping to ask for directions to her room. His shoes echoed loudly against the sterile floors, each step heavier than the last. When he reached Ruby's room, he paused just outside the door, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He knew he needed to be strong for her. She didn't need to see how angry and scared he was. Not right now. He stepped inside, and his heart clenched when he saw her. Ruby was lying in the hospital bed, her face pale, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying. But she was alive, and their baby was okay. That was all that mattered to Jacob in that moment. "Ruby," he whispered, rushing to her side and taking her hand in his. Her fingers tightened around his, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence, taking comfort in each other's presence. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to do. He just kicked me, Jacob. I didn't do anything, and he... Her words broke into sobs, and Jacob pulled her close, holding her tightly. "It's not your fault," he said firmly, though his heart was breaking inside. "None of this is your fault." He wanted to scream, to throw something, to let out all the rage building up inside of him. But he couldn't. Not here. Not now. He had to keep it together for Ruby's sake. But every second he held her, his mind was consumed with thoughts of that officer, the white cop who had kicked his wife and left her on the ground like she didn't matter. Jacob's grip on Ruby's hand tightened. He couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about his family. This was about the system that allowed men like Officer Declan to walk around with a badge, free to abuse their power without consequences. This was about every black person who had been brutalized, mistreated, or disrespected by law enforcement simply because of the color of their skin. "I'm going to take care of this," Jacob promised, his voice low and steady. "I swear, Ruby. He's not getting away with this. Not this time." Ruby nodded, but the fear in her eyes hadn't gone away. She knew better than anyone how hard Jacob had fought for justice in the past. She had seen firsthand the way the system bent over backward to protect its own, especially when the perpetrator was white and the victim black. She knew this fight would be different, harder. It was their family on the line now. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Jacob said, stroking her hair gently. "But we're going to get through this. I promise you, we're going to get through this." They stayed like that for a while, Jacob's mind racing with plans, strategies, and the weight of what was to come. He knew exactly who Officer Declan was. He had heard the name before, and other complaints whispered among other attorneys. Declan was one of those officers who always seemed to slip through the cracks, always just out of reach. Jacob wasn't going to let that happen this time. When the doctors finally came in to run another round of tests on Ruby, Jacob stepped out of the room, pacing the hallway. He felt like he was on the edge of a cliff, teetering between grief and rage. But one thing was certain. Declan had no idea who he had just messed with. Jacob pulled out his phone and began making calls. He wasn't just a lawyer, after all. He had connections. And now he was ready to use every single one of them to bring this cop down. There would be no hiding, no cover-ups, no way for Declan to slip away this time. Jacob's mind was clear. His fight wasn't just for his wife, but for every person who had been a victim of this corrupt system. Justice was coming. Declan just didn't know it yet. Jacob sat at the edge of his desk, his mind racing. The video of his wife Ruby being kicked by Officer Declan played on repeat in his head. He had watched it countless times, but every time he saw her hit the ground, he felt the same searing anger. This wasn't just some case he had taken on. It was personal. Ruby was the love of his life, and their baby, their first child, was already at risk because of that cop. Jacob knew that this wasn't just about getting justice for Ruby. It was about making sure that Officer Declan and the system that protected him paid for what they had done. The phone on his desk buzzed again. Another reporter. The story was spreading like wildfire. The video had gone viral and the community was on fire. Protests were already starting outside the police department, with people demanding that Officer Declan be suspended, arrested, or something. But the police department wasn't budging. In fact, they had started saying that Ruby wasn't telling the full story, that she was resisting, that Declan was only doing his job. Jacob threw his phone down in frustration. They were trying to paint his wife as the villain. This was exactly why he had taken up civil rights law, to fight these lies, these excuses that were always used to protect people like Declan. But this time, they had picked the wrong person to mess with. Jacob pulled out his laptop and opened up a new document. He was going to dig into Officer Declan's past. There had to be something there. Cops like Declan didn't just snap one day and attack a random black woman for no reason. This was a pattern. Jacob could feel it. The first place he looked was the local court records. There, he found the first hint of what he was looking for. Officer Declan had been named in 2 previous lawsuits involving the excessive use of force. Both cases had been quietly settled out of court, with no admission of guilt. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then Jacob checked the internal complaints within the police department. It wasn't public information, but Jacob had contacts. He knew people who could pull strings, and within a few hours, he had what he needed. There were 5 complaints against Officer Declan for racial profiling and use of excessive force, most of them involving black men. None of those complaints had led to any discipline. All of them had been investigated and dismissed. Jacob leaned back in his chair, anger bubbling in his chest. It was just as he thought. This cop had been hurting people for years, and the department had covered for him. They had allowed it, and now they were doing it again, this time with his wife. But Jacob knew this wouldn't be easy. The police department had already started spinning their side of the story. They were protecting Declan, just like they always did. Worse, they were starting to discredit Ruby. They were pushing a narrative that she had been aggressive and that Declan had no choice but to use force. It was all lies, but Jacob had seen it before. The department was trying to shift the blame, to protect themselves, and to paint the black victim as the problem. Jacob couldn't let them do that to Ruby. He couldn't let them smear her name like that, not when she had done nothing wrong. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of one of his most trusted colleagues, a fellow lawyer named Rachel, who had been through countless cases like this. "Rachel, I need your help," Jacob said as soon as she answered. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. There was no time for that. "I need to build a case against this cop, and I need to do it fast. They're already trying to destroy Ruby's reputation, and I can't let them get away with it." Rachel didn't need convincing. She knew what was at stake. "I've got your back," she said. "Send me everything you've got, and we'll start building the case." Jacob hung up the phone and exhaled. Now that Rachel was on board, things would start moving. But he knew they were up against a system that had been protecting people like Officer Declan for decades. And the police department wasn't going to roll over just because a video went viral. Jacob had been fighting these battles for years, and he knew how hard it would be. Over the next few days, Jacob and Rachel worked around the clock. Jacob combed through every detail of Officer Declan's past, finding more cases, more complaints, and more cover-ups. Rachel started reaching out to witnesses who had seen the attack on Ruby. Most of them had already posted their videos online, but Rachel knew how to turn those videos into evidence that would hold up in court. One night, as Jacob sat in his office, exhausted but determined, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a police officer, someone inside the department who didn't agree with what was happening but couldn't speak up publicly. The message contained something that stopped Jacob in his tracks: internal emails from the police department. The emails showed that the department had known about Declan's history of racist behavior for years. They had been covering it up, making excuses, and even protecting him when complaints came in. And now, in the wake of the attack on Ruby, they were scrambling to protect him again. Jacob read through the emails, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. This was what he needed. This was proof that it wasn't just Officer Declan who was guilty. It was the entire department. They had allowed this to happen. They had protected Declan, and now they were trying to protect themselves. Jacob forwarded the emails to Rachel. "This changes everything," he wrote. "We're going to take them down." The next morning, Jacob and Rachel filed the lawsuit against Officer Declan and the police department. They weren't just going after the cop who had attacked Ruby. They were going after the entire system that had allowed him to operate with impunity. It was a bold move, one that would put them in the national spotlight. But Jacob didn't care. This wasn't about fame or attention. This was about justice. As the lawsuit made headlines, the police department doubled down. They started leaking information to the press, trying to paint Ruby as someone who had provoked the attack. They claimed that Officer Declan was just doing his job and that the situation had been misrepresented. But Jacob wasn't worried. He had the emails, he had the evidence, and he had the truth on his side. The protests outside the police department grew larger and louder. People were angry, not just at what had happened to Ruby, but at the system that continued to allow people like Officer Declan to thrive. Jacob watched the news reports, feeling the weight of the moment. This was bigger than him, bigger than Ruby. This was about a fight that had been going on for far too long, a fight for justice, for accountability, and for an end to the violence that black people faced every day at the hands of law enforcement. As the trial date approached, Jacob knew they had a long road ahead of them. But for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had the truth, they had the evidence, and they had the power of the people behind them. And no matter how hard the police department fought to protect Officer Declan, Jacob was going to make sure that justice was served. He looked over at Ruby, who was sitting on the couch, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. She smiled at him, a look of quiet strength in her eyes. Jacob knew that this fight wasn't just for her. It was for their unborn child, for their future, and for every person who had been harmed by a system that refused to see them as equal. The battle had only just begun, but Jacob was ready. They were ready, and this time, the system wouldn't win. Officer Declan leaned back in his chair, watching the local news station flicker across the TV screen. Another protest was forming downtown, but he barely paid it any attention. His phone buzzed on the desk, and with a grunt, he reached for it, expecting it to be one of his buddies from the force checking in about the latest drama. Instead, his heart skipped a beat when he saw the notification on the screen. Breaking news: civil rights lawyer Jacob Lewis files lawsuit against Officer Declan and police brutality case. For a second, he didn't believe it. But when he swiped open the article, his stomach dropped. There was his name, his actions, and the face of the woman he had kicked, Ruby Lewis, staring back at him. It was all over the news. And worse, her husband was Jacob Lewis, a name that everyone in the city recognized. Jacob wasn't just any lawyer. He was the lawyer. The one who had taken down corrupt cops before. The one who had fought for justice in the most publicized civil rights cases in the state. And now he was coming after him. Officer Declan stood up, his head spinning. His hands were shaking. Jacob Lewis. Of all people, it had to be him. He began pacing back and forth across the small office, trying to calm the panic rising in his chest. It was just a traffic stop, he thought. How was I supposed to know who she was? He cursed under his breath, remembering how he'd acted. He could see it so clearly in his mind, the way Ruby had flinched, her eyes wide with fear as he barked orders at her. How he'd felt the rush of power when he kicked her. It was a scene he had played out countless times in his career, but this time he had picked the wrong person. The news report had been brief, but it was enough. His actions were going viral, spreading across social media faster than wildfire. The article mentioned the lawsuit Jacob had filed, claiming that Officer Declan had assaulted Ruby without cause and that his actions were motivated by racial bias. Declan blood ran cold. Racial bias. That was the word that could ruin him. If the media and the public latched onto that, he was done. His job, his reputation, everything he had worked for could crumble in an instant. Declan rushed to his laptop, typing Jacob Lewis's name into the search bar. Dozens of articles popped up. There was no escaping it. Jacob's face was plastered everywhere. The lawyer's reputation was legendary. He had fought and won against multiple police departments for racial profiling, police brutality, and wrongful arrests. He was articulate, calm under pressure, and knew exactly how to use the media to his advantage. Worst of all, he was relentless. Declan clicked on a video interview of Jacob speaking outside the courthouse. His calm, determined voice filled the room. "This case is not just about my wife," Jacob said, staring directly into the camera. "It's about a system that has allowed officers like Declan to act with impunity. It's about accountability, and it's about ending the cycle of violence and discrimination against Black Americans at the hands of those who are sworn to protect them." Declan felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. Jacob was painting a picture of him as part of a broken, racist system, and Jacob had the voice, the platform, and the connections to make sure that everyone in the city and the country knew about it. Declan was no longer just a cop under fire. He was the symbol of everything wrong with the police, and Jacob was going to use him to send a message. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was one of his superiors. The text was short and to the point. "We need to talk." Declan's heart pounded harder. They were all scared. They knew the lawsuit could bring more heat than they were ready for. And if this blew up any further, they'd need someone to blame, someone to throw under the bus. Damn it. Declan slammed his fist onto the desk, knocking over his coffee. He wiped it up with a tissue, his mind racing. He needed a way out of this, but his options were limited. The media was already all over the story, and Jacob Lewis was a force to be reckoned with. He couldn't just brush this under the rug like some other complaints he'd faced. This was different. He had kicked a pregnant woman in broad daylight, and now her husband was the one coming after him. Desperate, Declan picked up his phone and dialed one of his friends on the force, Sergeant Daniels. "Daniels, you see the news?" There was a pause on the other end before Daniels's gruff voice answered. "Yeah, I saw it. Man, this is bad. Real bad. What do I do?" Declan's voice cracked, betraying his fear. Daniels sighed. "There's not much you can do, man. It's Jacob Lewis. The guy's a shark. I've heard he's already gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, pulling every string he can. You better brace yourself. This thing is about to get ugly." Declan clenched his teeth, his mind whirling. He knew that Daniels was right. Jacob was building a case, and with every day that passed, more people were jumping on the bandwagon, demanding justice for Ruby. The protests outside the police department were growing larger, with signs reading, "Justice for Ruby," and "End Racist Policing." The heat was closing in, and he had no idea how to stop it. But there was one thing he knew for sure. Jacob Lewis wasn't going to stop until he brought him down. But if he didn't come up with a plan, and fast, his entire career, and possibly his freedom, were on the line. Declan sank back into his chair, staring at the floor. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? One moment, he was in charge, a man in power, and the next, he was the target of a media frenzy, his name being dragged through the mud. He needed to talk to his lawyer and figure out what his options were. Maybe he could get ahead of this somehow, spin the story in his favor. After all, he wasn't the only one involved. The department had let this happen. They had covered for him before. Why would this time be any different? His thoughts were interrupted by another notification on his phone. This time, a headline that made his heart race even faster. Jacob Lewis to hold press conference tomorrow. Major evidence to be revealed. Evidence? Declan muttered, his mouth dry. What could Jacob possibly have? What did he know? The reality hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about what happened on that street corner. Jacob had resources, connections, and the will to dig into every corner of his past. If Jacob could prove that this wasn't just a one-time mistake, if he could show that Declan had a history of racist actions and misconduct, then the lawsuit would only be the beginning. His life would be over. Declan frantically scrolled through his phone, searching for anything that could give him a clue about what Jacob had found. But there was nothing concrete yet. Just speculation and rumors. But the press conference dragged on, and with every hour that passed, Declan felt the walls closing in. By the time night fell, he had exhausted every option he could think of. There was no way out of this. Jacob Lewis wasn't just fighting for his wife, he was coming for him personally. And the worst part, Declan realized deep down that he deserved it. He had crossed the line, and now he was going to pay for it. The next morning, Declan woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing again. This time it was his lawyer, calling to discuss the press conference. Declan answered, but his mind was already elsewhere. He knew the truth was going to come out, one way or another. He had kicked a pregnant woman, a black woman, because he thought he could. And now, he was about to face the consequences. Jacob Lewis wasn't just any husband. He was a man who fought for justice, and this time, justice had a name. It was Ruby. The courtroom was packed, the air was thick with tension, and every seat was filled. People leaned forward, their eyes glued to the front, waiting to see what would happen next. Ruby sat beside Jacob, her hand resting on her swollen belly, a reminder of how vulnerable she had been when the attack happened. Officer Declan sat a few feet away, his expression tense but unreadable. He had traded his police uniform for a suit, but nothing could hide the fear in his eyes. He knew he had everything to lose. The trial had drawn national attention. News cameras flashed outside, and reporters filled the gallery, ready to capture every word spoken in the courtroom. The case had become more than just about the assault on Ruby. It was about racial injustice, police brutality, and a system that had allowed men like Declan to get away with their actions for far too long. As the judge called the court to order, the room fell into a hushed silence. Jacob rose from his seat, straightened his tie, and slowly walked to the front of the courtroom. His every step was measured, his face focused and calm. But inside, he was burning with anger and determination. This was no longer just another case for him. This was personal. He was fighting for his wife, for his unborn child, and for every black person who had ever been mistreated by someone like Declan. The jury was watching Jacob closely. They had heard Ruby's testimony earlier in the week. Her voice had trembled as she recounted the night Officer Declan had kicked her. The way she described the pain, the fear, the humiliation, it was clear to everyone in the room that this was not just an accident. This was a deliberate act of violence, and Ruby's tears had left an indelible mark on the jurors. But now, it was Jacob's turn to deliver his closing argument, and he knew this was his moment to make them see the truth. He paused for a moment, letting the silence fill the room before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady, "what happened to my wife, Ruby, wasn't just an act of violence. It was an act of hatred. It was the product of a system that has, for far too long, allowed men like Officer Declan to believe that they can treat black people with cruelty and get away with it." His words hung in the air. The jury's eyes widened slightly. They were paying attention now. Jacob walked closer to the jurors, his tone growing more intense but still controlled. "This case isn't just about Ruby. It's about every black man, woman, and child who has ever been afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them. It's about a history of racism, about people in power who think they can act however they want, simply because they wear a badge." The jurors glanced at each other, the weight of Jacob's words sinking in. They knew the case was more than just about Ruby's assault. It was about justice, about accountability, and about righting the wrongs of a system that had protected people like Declan for too long. Jacob didn't give them a chance to look away. He continued, his voice filled with passion. "Officer Declan didn't just kick Ruby because she hesitated to get out of her car. He kicked her because of what she looked like. He saw a black woman, and he thought he could treat her however he wanted. He thought that no one would care. But today, you have the power to show him and the world that you do care, that what he did was wrong, and that justice will be served." He let those words linger, and in the silence that followed, it was clear the jury was hooked. Jacob had struck a nerve. In the back of the room, the reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture every word. The tension was palpable, and even those watching on live streams from their homes could feel it. Jacob had crafted his argument carefully, revealing just enough to build anticipation without giving everything away too soon. Each statement left the jurors wanting more, needing to understand the full picture before they made their final decision. Jacob glanced at Ruby, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and fear. She had trusted him to seek justice for what had happened to her, and he wasn't going to let her down. He turned back to the jury, preparing to deliver the final piece of his argument. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, holding it up for the jury to see, "is Officer Declan's disciplinary record. A record filled with complaints from other black citizens, each one detailing how he mistreated them, how he used his power to intimidate, to bully, and yes, even to harm. Each one of these complaints was ignored, buried by the system." There was a murmur in the courtroom as Jacob unfolded the paper and began to read. "Here's one. Officer Declan pulled me over for no reason, called me a racial slur, and threatened to arrest me if I didn't comply. Here's another. I was walking home when Officer Declan stopped me, pushed me against a wall, and searched me without any cause." The jurors' expressions shifted. What they had seen as an isolated incident was suddenly part of a larger, more troubling pattern. Jacob could see their minds turning, piecing together the evidence, understanding that this case was about more than just what happened to Ruby. It was about a man who had abused his power for years and a system that had led him. As Jacob continued, the weight of his argument became undeniable. The system failed Ruby, just as it failed every other person who filed a complaint. But today, you have the power to change that. You have the power to send a message that we will no longer tolerate racism, hatred, or violence in our police force. That no matter who you are, no matter what color your skin is, you deserve justice. He looked each juror in the eye, making sure they felt a responsibility on their shoulders. "I know this is a heavy burden," he said softly, his voice filled with empathy. "But you have the opportunity to do the right thing, to stand up for Ruby and for every black person who has been mistreated by people like Officer Declan. You can be the change." The room was silent. Even Officer Declan, who had spent most of the trial with a smug look on his face, seemed rattled. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that Jacob had made a strong case. Jacob stepped back, letting his final words sink in. "Justice is not just a word we throw around. It's something we must fight for, something we must protect. And today, I ask you to deliver justice for Ruby, for our child, and for all the people who deserve better from those sworn to protect us." With that, he returned to his seat beside Ruby. She squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes welling with tears. She knew he had done everything he could. The judge gave the jury their instructions, and as they filed out to begin their deliberations, the tension in the room only grew. Everyone knew that the decision they were about to make was bigger than just this one case. It was about accountability. It was about justice. And it was about setting a precedent that police officers could no longer hide behind their badges when they acted with hatred. Hours passed, and as the jury returned, the entire room held its breath. The judge asked the foreperson, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Officer Declan, guilty of assault and misconduct." A collective sigh of relief washed over the room. Ruby sobbed quietly, leaning into Jacob's arms, while the community members sitting behind her let out cheers of triumph. Justice had been served, but it had been a hard one. As the verdict was read aloud, it was clear that something had shifted in the room. This wasn't just about punishing one bad cop. It was about beginning to dismantle a system that had allowed people like him to thrive. It was about hope, about change, and about justice finally finding its way to those who deserved it most. For Jacob, the fight wasn't over, but for now, he had won the most important battle of his life. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people took their seats. The air felt electric, thick with anticipation. Jacob Lewis sat at the front, his heart racing, knowing that today could change everything. He glanced at his wife, Ruby, who was sitting beside him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. It was the day of the verdict, and everyone in the room was aware that this was more than just a trial. It was about justice, about hope, and about the fight against racism that had gone on for far too long. The judge entered the room, and a hush fell over the crowd. Ruby held Jacob's hand tightly, squeezing it for comfort. They had been through so much together, and now they were at the brink of a moment that could define their lives and the future of their community. Jacob looked around the courtroom, noting the faces of friends, family, and supporters who had come to stand with them. There were signs of encouragement, justice for Ruby, and "we stand together." The presence of their community gave them strength, but the weight of the moment was heavy. As the judge began to speak, Jacob's thoughts raced. He couldn't help but think back to that fateful day when Officer Declan had kicked Ruby. He remembered the look of pain on her face, the terror in her eyes, and how helpless he had felt. He had dedicated his life to fighting for justice, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of seeing his own wife suffer at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect them. Now they were here, ready to face the system that had failed them for so long. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "We have reached the conclusion of this case. The jury has deliberated, and I will now read their verdict." Silence enveloped the room. Jacob held his breath, and Ruby looked straight ahead, her expression resolute. They were both scared, but they wouldn't back down. On the charge of assault against Ruby Lewis, we find the defendant, Officer Declan, guilty. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Gasps and murmurs echoed around them as supporters erupted into cheers. Ruby's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She turned to Jacob and hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his embrace and the support of their community surrounding them. But before they could fully celebrate, the judge continued, "Officer Declan, you are also found guilty of misconduct. You will face sentencing shortly." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. While the guilty verdict was a victory, it wasn't over yet. Declan sat there, his face pale and devoid of the bravado he had shown throughout the trial. The reality of his situation began to sink in, and it was clear that he had not anticipated the outcome. Jacob felt a mix of triumph and anger, knowing that Declan's actions had caused deep wounds, not just to Ruby, but to their entire community. The courtroom was filled with emotion, and Jacob took a moment to soak it all in. He looked at Ruby, who was still holding on to him tightly. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We actually did it." As the cheers erupted, the judge banged his gavel to restore order. "I will now set a date for sentencing. Court is adjourned." The crowd began to move, people hugging and celebrating. But Jacob and Ruby remained in their seats for a moment longer, holding on to each other as they processed the whirlwind of emotions. Once outside the courtroom, the air was filled with excitement. Reporters swarmed, microphones in hand, eager to capture the moment. Jacob felt the weight of their eyes, and for a brief moment, he was overwhelmed by the attention. But this was not about him. It was about Ruby and the message they had fought to convey. "Mr. Lewis, Mrs. Lewis, how do you feel about the verdict?" a reporter shouted, pushing closer. Jacob cleared his throat, knowing that this was their chance to speak out. "We're grateful for the jury's decision," he said, his voice steady. "But this is just the beginning. We still have a long way to go in our fight against systemic racism in law enforcement." He glanced at Ruby, who nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about one officer," Ruby added, her voice strong. "It's about all the people who have suffered at the hands of those who are meant to protect us. We hope this verdict is a step towards change." The crowd cheered again, their support echoing in the air as Jacob and Ruby made their way through the throngs of people. They felt a sense of purpose, knowing they had ignited a fire within their community. As they reached their car, Ruby turned to Jacob. "What happens now?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "We wait for sentencing and then we keep fighting," he replied. "We keep raising awareness, pushing for reform, and making sure this never happens again." They drove home together, hand in hand, both feeling a sense of relief wash over them. But the fight wasn't over. They knew that there were still so many people out there who needed help and support, and they were committed to being the voices for those who felt voiceless. Over the following weeks, the community rallied together, organizing events and meetings to discuss police reform and racial equality. Ruby and Jacob were at the forefront, sharing their story and encouraging others to stand up against injustice. The local news covered their journey extensively, bringing more attention to the issue and igniting a movement that spread far beyond their small town. As the date for Declan's sentencing approached, tension hung in the air. Many in the community were eager to see what punishment he would receive. Would he get a slap on the wrist, or would he face real consequences for his actions? Jacob and Ruby knew that the sentencing would set a precedent, and they wanted it to reflect the gravity of the situation. Finally, the day arrived. The courtroom was packed with supporters, activists, and community members who had come to witness the sentencing of Officer Declan. Ruby wore a powerful expression of determination, and Jacob stood by her side, feeling the strength of their united front. As the judge entered, the atmosphere was tense. Declan sat with his lawyer, the weight of the moment evident on his face. Jacob could see the anxiety in Declan's eyes, and for a moment, he felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the man who had caused so much pain was finally facing the consequences. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Officer Declan, you stand before this court after being found guilty of assault and misconduct. The actions you took on that day were not just a violation of the law, but a betrayal of the trust placed in you by the community. In my opinion, this court must send a message that such behavior will not be tolerated." The judge paused, looking around the room. "Given the severity of your actions and the impact they had on Ruby Lewis and her family, I am sentencing you to 3 years in prison." Gasps echoed through the courtroom, but Ruby felt a rush of relief. Justice had been served, and the community's message had been heard loud and clear. As the judge banged the gavel, Jacob turned to Ruby, who was already crying tears of joy. "We did it," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We really did it." But even in that moment of triumph, Jacob knew that the fight wasn't over. The sentencing was just one battle in a much larger war against racial injustice. He and Ruby had made a difference, but there was still so much work to be done. In the weeks that followed, Ruby and Jacob became more involved in community organizing. They spoke at schools, churches, and local events, sharing their story and inspiring others to take action. They called for changes in police training, accountability measures, and community engagement, determined to ensure that what happened to Ruby would never happen again. As they continued their work, they also focused on their growing family. Ruby's pregnancy had progressed, and she was filled with excitement and a sense of purpose. The couple began preparing for the arrival of their child, envisioning a future where their family would thrive in a community that was stronger and more united. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Jacob turned to Ruby. "I want our child to grow up knowing they can be proud of who they are," he said softly. "I want them to know that they come from a legacy of strength and resilience." Ruby smiled, placing her hand on her belly. "And I want to teach them to stand up for what's right, just like we did. No matter what challenges they face, they'll know they're not alone." As the couple settled in for the night, they felt a sense of hope for the future. They knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but they were ready to face them together, united by love and their shared commitment to justice. The fight against racism and injustice would continue, but with every step they took, they were making a difference, not just for themselves, but for countless others. And as they prepared to welcome their new baby into the world, they knew they were laying the foundation for a brighter, more equitable future. In the end, Ruby and Jacob emerged as powerful advocates for change, driven by their love for each other and their unwavering commitment to fighting for justice. They would not only be parents, but also leaders in their community, ensuring that their child would grow up in a world where love, acceptance, and equality prevailed. And so, their story continued, a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow.